Today we are starting our discussion on the Great Discourse, like I promised, and we're going to take the first session on the topic that says, Man, where did the journey begin? Now, to form the background for this discussion, the basis for our discussion will be two books. We're going to take this book, My First Atlas, written by Colin Clark and edited by Maurice Sojourn. English edition translated from Italian. We're going to take content from there. We're going to also take from the scriptures. So this one will represent the material world, and that will be the spiritual world. It will represent the spiritual, the physical and the material. So we are going to read from the Atlas. It says, Africa is the continent from which early man spread out all over the world. Africa is the continent from which early man spread out all over the world. And when we read from the scriptures, it says in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The heaven and the earth. Verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him. Now, if we piece these two together, we will find out that God created man. God made the heavens and earth, and after created man, where? That the Atlas answers that Africa is the continent from which the early man spread out to the rest of the world. Invariably, it means when God created man, it was in Africa. Where God created man was in Africa. When God created man, God was in Africa when he created man. And so, it could be in heaven, but God created man in Africa from what we could see. Now, if we put this together, it means that man's ancestral home is Africa. And Africa is the land of the ancient. Man's ancestral home is Africa, and Africa is the land of the ancient, because it's from Africa that the early man spread to the rest of the world. Now, if we put that together, we see when God created man in Africa, as invariably as we can put the two together, what happened? God planted the garden and put man in the garden. So God created man in Africa, planted the garden where in Africa, put man in that garden. Where was the garden located, and where is the garden located? In Africa, because God planted the garden in Africa and put that. From what we see here, Africa is the continent from which the early man spread. Now, when the early man spread from Africa to the rest of the world, after God's creation of the early man, of man, they now spread from the Garden of Eden. After the fall, they spread to the rest of the world. It means that from Africa, all the inhabitants, all the people that are inhabiting Europe, whatever, they came from Africa. From Africa, they migrated and they formed settlement in Asia, whether in Middle East, whether in Far East, and from there they moved to Europe and formed settlements in Europe. From Europe, they formed settlement in Americas, whether South America, North America, and Australia. So man spread to these areas from Africa. Africa was the beginning of the journey. Africa was the beginning of the journey that man embarked on and spread to the rest of the world. So every other inhabitants of the world came from Africa. And the Garden of Eden was located in Africa. And man's ancestral home is Africa. Man, the land of the ancient is Africa. And that is the design of the Ancient of Days. That's in Africa. Now, as man moved from Africa to the rest of the world, man established systems and structures, whether they are cultural systems and structures, political systems and structures, economic systems and structures, legal systems and structures, social systems and structures, educational systems and structures, and military systems and structures. Man established these systems and structures. Why? Because man was looking for desire for was existential survival. Man wanted to survive. In order to do that, he created some of these structures as they spread from Africa to the rest of the world, including legal systems and structures. So they spread all these, they established systems and structures from Africa all through the rest of the world. Remember, man started this journey now from Africa. God created man where in Africa. So Africa is the home, is the ancestral home of mankind. The ancestral home of mankind. Now, the Garden of Eden, located in Africa. Now you see that God planted a lot of things in Africa. God put a lot of resources in Africa. That's why you see how Africa is with too many abundant resources that no one could exhaust, and no one can exhaust, no matter, even if the inhabitants of the earth could be as many as 50 billion. Only Africa could take care of it, because that's how God designed Africa to be. Is the continent, is the region of man's early creation. And so nothing can be far from that. That is why, because Africa is the land of God's first human creation. That is why you see all this push and pull to control Africa, both from human beings, both from physical beings, and from spiritual beings. From spiritual beings, some of these spiritual beings, in most cases, they instigate, they possess human beings to fight against Africa. They possess human beings to fight against Africa, whether colonialists, whatever they possess. Even from Africa themselves, they will have ferocious attack by even Africans against the land of Africa, against the land of the ancient. So forces from outside, forces from inside, they are all after Africa, against Africa, fighting for control of resources, fighting for control of a lot of things. Now, I have to make it very clear that all the things that are happening in Africa, fighting against Africa, fighting in the land of Africa, fighting for the control resources in Africa, they are not just physical. Yes, we have all those. They are not just physical, but they are spiritual. They are spiritual in the sense that Africa is the ancestral home of mankind. So Africa is God's own land. Africa is God's own land, created for the habitation of human beings. So all these forces are fighting to control Africa. And then these forces are fighting to control Africa. Dark forces fighting to control Africa. They are using human beings to fight against the land of the ancient. That is Africa. They are using human beings. That is why you see all this struggle, all this push and pull. But the inhabitants of Africa should know that Africa is the land of the ancient. No one can destroy the land of Africa. And you see, there are too many angels in Africa, and those too many angels are fighting for the continent of Africa, to preserve the land of the ancient against the forces, against the dark forces that are fighting. That's why you see a lot of things happening in Africa, a lot of forces fighting against Africa, fighting against the land of God's first creation. Do you know why there are too many abundant resources found in Africa? Do you know why? Do you know why no power can destroy Africa? Do you know why God began salvation from and in Africa? Do you know why the angels of God are jealously guarding Africa? Do you know why ferocious forces, even dark forces, are fighting against Africa? It's because it is the land of God. It is the land of the ancient people. It is the location of the Garden of Eden. And so the angels are ferociously guarding the Garden of Eden, but there are forces, from dark forces, that's why you see all these happenings in Africa. So from Africa, you see all these structures established all through that, whether they are cities, whether they are countries, whether they are nation states, they came from Africa and spread to the rest of the world. So that is what we see in Africa happening. In the next session, we are going to see how man lost the image of God. That's where we're going to end this session. Catch us in the next session.